Let's recap some of their recent series, June. So the Mets took 2 of 3 from the Diamondbacks after Wednesday's 7-1 win. They're just 5-5 though over their last 10 games. They still sit atop the division, though their hot start has fairly cooled down a bit. So, June, what are your thoughts on the Mets' performance so far this season?
Yeah, I think that they're in a good spot. I mean, this is one of those things where, you're going to go 500. It's a baseball season. There's 162 games. So it's hard to overreact to any one stretch of games, especially when the team is this talented. And it feels like there's a lot of good energy behind this team right now, especially after the signing of Soto. And so, it's great that they got off to a hot start because we've seen how quickly things can get really nihilistic and apocalyptic almost when the Mets start off a season as poorly as they have in the past. And so, given how much the expectations have weighed on this team so far, I think it's a good thing that the team is off to such a hot start and, is trying to kind of find the balance where, it's not sustainable to play as good as they did for the first few weeks of the season.
Yeah, for sure. And also, the season is so long. So there's going to be the ebbs and flows, the highs and lows of a year. So you can only hope that they try to stay as consistent as they are. But when you are off to a hot start, it is kind of tough to kind of come down from that because, yes, New York Mets fans are very impatient. And as you know, New York sports fans in general, we just want everything right now. But you mentioned Juan Soto. He hit 2 homers yesterday, but overall, he hasn't looked like himself, so to speak. Speaking of Mets fans being impatient, especially with runners in scoring position, do you think that he is just unlucky or is he pressing? What do you think it is with Juan Soto?
I think it's a couple things happening right now. First, if you look at Soto's career statistics in April, it's always been the slowest start. He always starts slow with seasons. In his career, he's hitting like 253, I believe, in the month of April. So what he's doing right now is actually not that different from his career norms. Of course, on top of that, he's got the pressure of having the biggest contract in baseball history now. So there's that. But if you go to Baseball Savant, you look at all the peripherals, you look at all the advanced statistics, everything is kind of in par for what he's done over the course of his career. He's still hitting the ball hard. He's barreling up the ball hard. I think the numbers not being up there is partially due to luck, probably partially due to the pressure of being the highest paid baseball player in history. But I think overall, this is kind of in line with who Juan Soto has been. And as the weather gets warmer, he tends to heat up as well.
It does. But yeah, I also do think it does come down to a bit of pressure and also just kind of getting into a groove, being that now you're with a new team too. But Pete Alonso seems like he is handling the pressure very well, if there is any pressure on him at this point. He was named the NL Player of the Month for April. How important has his success been to the team overall? And I think that's
Well,
also like understated too.
Yeah, I mean, I think Pete is the heart and soul of the Mets in many singles way. He's the guy who came up through the franchise and has been one of the most popular players, not just on the Mets but in baseball. He's one of those guys that is kind of on the border of being a transcendent outside of baseball star because he plays in a big market like New York and he's as beloved as he is. He does have something to prove, especially after this past offseason, not getting the big contract that him and Scott Boras wanted. And so I think when you look at Pete's situation in particular, there is a desire for him to go out and show that even at 30 years old, that maybe he was a little bit undervalued on the trade market. That being said, it's debatable whether or not, he got fair market value. He is a first baseman and, he's not the best defensive first baseman. There are a lot of people who hit for a lot of power, but it is undeniable that Pete Alonso hits the ball harder than just about anyone in the entire sport. And while he is a first baseman that, doesn't have, bring as much to the table as a center fielder does or shortstop does in terms of the defensive stuff, it's hard to kind of raise your defensive war when you're playing first base and raise your overall value profile as a player. I think Pete's biggest value to this team is just being that consistent guy on a day-to-day basis. Like you go into the Mets club, he's always upbeat. He's always trying to be the same guy on a day-to-day basis. It doesn't really matter whether or not he's having a good stretch or a bad stretch. He tends to be kind of the same and always trying to, be an uplifting guy, banter with his teammates. And so when he is doing good, I think it's one of those things that really kind of keeps the fan base energy up because, everyone loves Pete in New York. And so when Pete's doing well, it's a lot easier for Mets fans to just feel good about what's going on and navigate the kind of the ups and downs of the season.
Yeah, he's when he is playing well, it does have a positive ripple effect, I think, across the entire organization. And he's been the driving force of this offense too. Let's go through some injury updates. So, June, the Mets continue to deal with injuries. Jesse Winker is now expected to miss 6 to 8 weeks with an oblique strain, and Brett Baty is back in the big leagues now. We talk about pressure for Juan Soto, and it seems like Brett Baty is feeling a bit of pressure, and he's trying to navigate that. But so far, he's kind of been this like up and down guy. Do you think that this is his last best shot to prove that he belongs in the big leagues?
I'm not sure about the big leagues. That might be taking it a bit too far, but I wonder if this is his last opportunity with the Mets, because I remember when he was coming up, Mets fans were clamoring for him to make it up to the major leagues and make an impact, because it was at that point it was between him and Vientos for the third base spot, and there was a lot of demand for someone to fill that spot who was a young player, because what was going on there at the time just wasn't working for them. And so I do think that Baty's in the spot where, he's had more than a full season in the big leagues at this point, if you add up the games, and he hasn't hit above, I think it was above 230. And so, it might be that like the pressure and the spotlight of being in New York, doesn't necessarily vibe with who he is as a player. Like, I know that fans were really excited about him when they came up, and with that comes a lot of expectations. Like, I remember when, as a Red Sox fan myself, seeing Bobby Dahlbeck come out in Boston, and there was a lot of expectation and a lot of excitement from fans because he's this power hitting first baseman, and he had a good first couple of weeks. And after that, he kind of tailed off because of the ups and downs of playing big market and the pressure that comes with that. So, I'm not sure that this is the end of Brett Baty's career. Major teams tend to give top prospects a little bit more leeway, especially that track record from the minor leagues. And we've seen guys, not that Brett Baty was one of the top 5 prospects in baseball, but you see a guy like Jurickson Profar, who was at one point the top prospect in all of baseball, really kind of struggled to kind of establish himself in the big leagues over the course of his first few seasons. But he was able to kind of continue getting opportunities because he had that track record for talent. So I'm not sure that it's the end of Brett Baty's professional baseball career, but I do think that if he doesn't really stick at this time, it's going to be hard for the Mets to justify continuing to give him chances in this market.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Profar, but have you seen other players who are like Brett Baty who rake in the minors, but just can't quite find their footing in the majors? Why do you think that is? Like, what do you attribute that to? Do you think it just is a pressure thing? Do you think there is an adjustment period? And some people will probably say that that adjustment period has probably come and gone for Brett Baty. But what do you attribute that to?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bunch of different things. I think that there's often an underestimation for the gap between the talent level in AAA versus the talent level in the major leagues, because the best pitcher in AAA is maybe a quadruple A guy or a top prospect who's not going to be in AAA for that long. So it's not like you're seeing this consistent exposure to, high level pitching that you're going to see at the major league level. At the major league level, you're literally facing Hall of Fame guys who've been established major league veterans for 10 plus years, guys who've made all-star games. Like, that's the type of stuff that you're seeing on a night-to-night basis. And so the gap between like AA and AAA, and the gap between AAA and the major leagues, it's not even remotely close. And so even if you do put up these numbers in the minor leagues and you're putting up against, some of the best young talent in all of baseball, it's a completely different ball game when consistently you're starting to face guys who are Hall of Fame or some of the best people who've ever played. And on top of that, have more data, more strategy, have more experience than you do. And so, the thing that I often see is that guys come up to the major leagues, are very confident after going through a hot streak. And then once they start to struggle and teams start to adjust to them, and they have the scouting report and they see, this guy's swing leaves a hole in the inside part of the plate, so you got to attack him with, 90-mile-per-hour fastballs inside or sweepers on the outside. There's, they identify the holes in these swings. If you don't adjust back, and then your self-confidence starts to crumble, it's just this like snowball effect where, I mean, the moment that you can really see whether or not a guy is going to be capable of sustaining a major league career is if they're able to get out of that first slump, because lots of guys have a hot first 2 weeks in the major leagues before teams have a scouting report on them. It's when you start to struggle and teams do have a scouting report that if you're able to adjust back, if you're able to adjust your approach at the plate, able to adjust your mechanics to close any holes in your swing, that's when you start to see whether or not a guy can really stick it in the big leagues for the long term.